great to have you all here for another panel session. And we have a number of experts who I am very excited to talk to myself. My name is Andrea Dutton. I am a professor here at UW-Madison in the Department of Geoscience, which is kind of diagonally across the street from us. I also want to mention to you that you can visit go.wisc.edu/climate policy to view the online program and for a link to the live closed captions for this panel discussion. So we're going to start with some introductions from the panel members, and they're each going to talk for 5 minutes. Then I have some questions I'd like to ask them, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, both the live audience and online, for some more questions after that. So I'll tell you first, very briefly, my perspective coming to this discussion is that I'm kind of colloquially, I guess, a climate scientist, but I'm a geologist, a field geologist, and a geochemist. I study past climate change and sea level rise to try to understand the dynamics of the Earth system and to try to prepare us for what to expect as we move into the future. So that's kind of where I approach this discussion from. But I also do a lot of work talking to public audiences. And so I really love opportunities like this where we can connect with people outside of our silos, if you will, and across all these different kind of range of expertise that you see here in front of you, which is really exciting. The other reason I'm excited to talk about this today is that I've recently moved here from the state of Florida, which is a very climate impacted state. And yes, I do study sea level rise, and I moved from Florida to Wisconsin. But I will tell you, since we're talking about solutions today, that solution is not very scalable, right? So we want to focus on solutions that will work. But I am still learning about all of the climate risks and impacts here in the state of Wisconsin. And so that's what we're really going to dive into for this panel. So the topic of this panel, as it's written on the webpage, is on the effects of climate change, everything that we're seeing today play out in real time. Heat waves, wildfires, droughts, storms, and flooding, which are being felt around the world and also here in the United States, and that's all expected to worsen in the future. So we're going to talk a little bit about science, but a lot also about climate impacts and risk and policy actions to prepare for them. So at this point, I'm going to actually turn to our panel members, and if it's okay with you, I'm going to go alphabetically by last name. So Kathy, you're going to be up first. And just briefly, her bio, everyone's bio is online if you want to go read more about them. But Kathy Blumenfeld is the secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. And so we're very pleased to have her expertise from the financial angle with us today. Kathy, you want to go ahead?
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for being here, and to the Follette School of Public Affairs for holding this on. There's a little circle up on the screen that talks about research, policy, and impact. And in the middle of it is the Wisconsin idea, really. This is the Wisconsin idea in action today. So thank you all for being here and being so interested in this topic. So I, as Andrea said, I'm the secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. I've been in this role for about 2.5 years and was appointed by Governor Evers when he was elected. And in our agency, we oversee the regulation of banks and credit unions. Those are state chartered banks and credit unions. We oversee the investing public by regulating investment advisors and broker dealers. We're the state record keeper. So anyone, raise your hand if you've been to our website, if you've ever filed for an LLC or a partnership, a charitable organization. We oversee charitable organizations. We also house the Office of Financial Literacy. And we do work in the field of student debt and college affordability. And we oversee the college savings programs for Wisconsin EdVest and Tomorrow Scholars. So I am thrilled to be here. I feel like I'll be coming to you more with the perspective of a regulator. I'm a CPA by trade. I came out of the insurance and financial services industry. Which Kristofer will tell you, and they're quite more mature in this space, I think, than the financial institutions are. But there's been an awakening in the financial institution and really the financial sector, I'd say in the last 18 months. So I could go through alphabet soup of, the Fed and FDIC, the NCUA, the CFTC, every alphabetical financial organization has kind of had an awakening to the systematic impact of climate change. And so I know Governor Evers had a task force. I think several of you were participants, and I was added. I think I woke a little bit later, but was able to join in towards the end of that task force. And I feel in Wisconsin, we have a lot of opportunity to educate and build awareness and help understand the financial impacts of climate change. So interestingly enough, when I started my career back in the late 80s, it was right after the savings and loan debacle. So you might remember, for some of you that were around or read it in your history books, as interest rates shot up, savings and loans were failing left and right because they hadn't really anticipated such a massive rate change. And interest rate risk was a risk that really wasn't contemplated very well. So one of my first jobs in the financial services industry was to travel around to each credit union and help them understand and model the interest rate risk that was embedded in their balance sheet. And I think that's analogous a little bit to what's happening with financial institutions today. Is there's this risk out there, which is climate risk, yet it's not monetized and not fully embedded in their balance sheets. And so I am excited to be able to be part of the conversation and pledge to work very collaboratively with our financial institutions to help bring awareness and help eventually provide the disclosures, provide the monetization of what that risk is, so that we can really, again, DFI, we're there to ensure the safety and soundness of our financial institutions. And so capturing this risk is going to be really important. So I'm excited to be here today, and we'll offer that perspective.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Okay, we have a really kind of diverse perspectives here today, which is one of the kind of overarching themes from today, is to bring together people from diverse perspectives, which I absolutely love, because that's something that I've been ranting on about in the class I'm teaching this semester, which is just introductory geology, but always making the point how people with different perspectives can bring so much more to our understanding. And so next we're going to move to Kristofer Canto, who is with American Family Insurance, which many of you have probably heard of. He joined them initially as a sustainability analyst and has, I think, a dizzying array of tasks from the list that I can see on his bio on the website. So I hope he's going to tell us more about what he does there. Kristofer, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? All right. All right. Very good. Yeah. So thank you. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be with you all today. First, just wanted to extend my appreciation as well to the Follette School of Public Affairs for hosting this event and the invitation to speak. It's great to be back on campus. Personally, my first speaking engagement in quite some time. So done a lot of virtual, but it's good to be back in person. Yeah, my name's Kristofer Canto, and while I'm not an alumnus of the Follette School, I consider myself a close cousin. I received both my master's and undergraduate degrees from UW-Madison here in urban and regional planning, environmental studies, and landscape architecture. So I'm not a climate scientist by any means, and I'm also not a certified accountant. However, I think it's through that academic training that I really developed this kind of systems thinking perspective, whether it's ecological systems, urban systems, transportation, infrastructure, stormwater management, et cetera, that I really started to think about the world in kind of this systems thought process. And I think that's really translated well into my professional career path in sustainability and climate action. So as mentioned, I worked in the public sector for a bit with the Wisconsin DOT, doing some environmental planning, and then had an opportunity to join American Family Insurance as a sustainability analyst. In that role, I helped kind of, sustainability initiatives, waste, water, land management type of work, as well as helping develop and lead our sustainability and carbon neutrality, sustainability and climate strategy action plan, which ultimately led to some of the foundational work where we announced our commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030. So that was an exciting moment for us at American Family. And it was in that work that I actually got exposed to this concept of climate risk and resilience. I think I had always thought about resilience in academic training, but not necessarily from what the insurance industry can do in terms of climate risk and resilience space. And had the opportunity to move over to our enterprise risk management team, where I now lead our enterprise climate risk and resiliency efforts. So this includes work, monitoring kind of federal and state level climate related regulatory action, as well as conducting climate risk assessments and scenario analysis, which I'll be hopefully speaking on a bit in more detail later. So I've gotten to work with a lot of different stakeholder groups, government affairs, leaders such as Secretary Blumenfeld, and also Professor Vimont here from a climate science standpoint. So I think it's no secret that there's a renewed sense of urgency about the climate crisis. And as Secretary Blumenfeld said, there's kind of been an awakening in the financial sector and insurance industries as well. Banks also very much leading the way. And so I think this is primarily as we see the frequency and severity of extreme weather increase, as well as the economic impacts of those disasters. So we monitor this very closely, obviously, at American Family Insurance. And in 2020, there were 22 separate billion-dollar disaster events, which set a record for the United States. Perhaps more surprisingly, though, that this was the 7th consecutive year where we had 10 or more separate billion-dollar disaster events. So we're seeing the frequency and severity, as well as the cost of these events, exponentially increasing over the decades since 1980. And here in 2021, we've experienced 8 separate billion-dollar disaster events. I think beyond the direct economic impacts, however, I find the cascading impacts of climate risk and broader financial stability to be really fascinating. I think it's also very challenging and complex, but it's super interesting to study. And I think if we can figure this out, there'll be tremendous opportunity. So climate risk is very much systemic in nature, driven by many, many different systems interacting over long time horizons, with the outcomes being highly dynamic and often uncertain. And so I think personally, this is why I feel there's a need for a fundamental shift in how banks and large financial institutions think about climate risk and how we can combat the climate crisis. Admittedly, I know this is potentially Wisconsin focused, US focused, but we're quite behind our peers overseas. The European Union, central banks over there, large international insurers have really been leading the charge on quantifying climate-related financial risk, the frameworks and the methodologies to do so. But as Secretary Blumenfeld said, I think we're seeing that change. That alphabet soup she mentioned is massive and mind-boggling at times, but there is a lot going on at the federal and state level that's exciting to see, and will certainly have implications for us in the insurance industry. So I think just a couple closing remarks on what we can do. I think from a financial services perspective, we need to really think about how we can allocate and reallocate capital. So meaning, how do we create financial and product incentives that help support the reduction of carbon emissions and renewable technologies? But also on the flip side is adaptation, right? So we need to really think about how we develop innovative financial mechanisms that allow for the flow of private capital into more nature-based solutions, public sector infrastructure. And then I think finally, we just need to continue advocating for action. And I think why we're all here today. So with that, I think the financial services industry, insurance especially, is really uniquely positioned to lead on this. When electricity first started getting brought into homes, the insurance industry was there. When you think about transportation safety, the insurance industry was there. And I think similarly, we can be there for climate change as kind of the risk bearers of society. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you for that great introduction to your work, Kristofer. So another one of the themes for today's forums is to think about all the research and the data that we can bring to this conversation. I think our next panelist will help us to do that. Our final panelist here is Dan Vimont, who's a professor in the Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences Department, also just across the street if you want to go. But he is also involved on the solution side as well. He works closely with the Wisconsin Initiative on climate change impacts to develop knowledge and advance solutions for climate impacts in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. So I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. First of all, thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to the Follette Center for putting this excellent event on. I was very excited to be a part of this panel, and also very excited to be part of this panel with Kathy and Kristofer, people who are kind of at the front lines of taking action on adaptation and solutions to climate change. I guess I'm gonna start off with a little bit of context for what we're dealing with here. This is why I always feel like I'm a climate scientist, so I only get invited to a party once. So just to warn you ahead of time, that's an occupation.
Try being a regulator.
Yeah. So it's no surprise climate change is happening. And to just put things in context, for the history of humans, so earliest Homo sapien fossils go back about 125,000 years. For about 800,000 years, at least, for the records that we have, carbon dioxide concentration has fluctuated between about 150 and 300 parts per million. Probably longer than that. I should ask Andrea about this. She would be more of an expert on this than I. And about the middle of the 20th century, we started taking measurements. Charles Keeling started taking measurements at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. At that time, carbon dioxide concentration was just over 300 parts per million. In the next 50 years, and actually for the latter half of the 20th century, it continued to rise. And in April 2014, I remember this because it was my daughter's first birthday, we passed 400 parts per million carbon dioxide for the first time in the history of humans. And carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere fluctuate from year to year, or go through an annual cycle. And so after we passed 400 parts per million in April 2014, it went through its annual cycle. And then a year and a half later, in November 2015, we passed 400 parts per million for the last time. No one on the planet will ever again experience carbon dioxide concentrations below 400 parts per million. Personally, I think when we pass 500 parts per million, we'll probably say the same thing. I could be wrong on that. That's why I only get invited to parties once. That increase in carbon dioxide is associated with 1 to 2 degrees of climate change. We haven't experienced that much because part of that's been masked by aerosols and dusts in our atmosphere. So we've experienced about a degree of warming. And we're already feeling impacts, changes in sea level, changes in reductions in sea ice, reductions in land ice and glaciers, poleward shifts in the biosphere, and locally extreme precipitation, increases in precipitation. One of the things I guess that's true about this is that we're all affected in individual ways by climate change. And here in Wisconsin, we've warmed by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 50 years, and we've experienced the wettest decade on record, the last decade. But even for changes that are not local, such as a hurricane that parks itself over Houston for a couple of days, we are affected by that because we live in a connected society, a complex society where the impacts are not always felt, or they're felt in ways that we don't always anticipate ahead of time. There's good news and bad news associated with this. This comment that carbon dioxide concentration is where it's at, and it's going to stay there for a while. The bad news is that it's there. The good news is that this is the most predictable signal we have in the climate system right now, aside from the year-to-year annual cycle of summer to winter. And what that means is that all of us, in addition to being affected by it, all of us can be planning, all of us can be doing something about it in individual ways. And that's kind of an exciting opportunity, I think. There are lots of opportunities, and we're seeing examples of people taking advantage of opportunities to adapt to and mitigate climate change. And we'll have some examples a little later on here in the discussion here. So there's, moving forward from here, I think I'm excited to be part of this conversation. Doing something about climate change is inherently a conversation. I say that as a climate scientist, I'm individually the wrong person to ask about what we should do about climate change. In fact, all of us individually are the wrong person to ask, because I don't know what's going on with American family. I don't know how farmers manage their fields. I don't know how lake managers manage for water quality. But in conversation and in community, we have that conversation. We identify problems and we identify solutions together. I think that's one of the most exciting things about being in this field of climate adaptation, is that it's not an individual, it's all of us together. It's us coming to a forum and learning from each other and coming up with solutions together. So I'm very excited to be here, and thank you to all of you for being here, and to the Follette Center for inviting us here.
That's great. Great point to end on, Dan, for us to jump off on in this conversation that we're going to have together. So one of the things I sometimes say to public audiences when we think about climate risk is that humans aren't really well adapted to responding to these very slow moving threats that are there all the time, right? So like if you just close your eyes and imagine a tiger stalking through the jungle, and you kind of see it behind the trees, and just thinking about this makes your heart start to race already, right? That's what we're adapted to responding to in terms of risk. But this idea, when I say the words climate change, you should feel just as scared, right? If not more, but you don't, because we're not well adapted to that. So when we talk about climate risk, so I'm going to pose this to everyone on the panel eventually, let's help our audience understand what we see as some of the main drivers of climate risk, particularly here in the state of Wisconsin. And how different climate scenarios might impact that. Or I might ask to Kristofer and Kathy, are you even thinking about different scenarios? Does that even enter what you do? But that's a second hand. So at first, I'm going to start with you, Kristofer, and hand this to you about understanding the main drivers of climate risk that you see from your perspective, and maybe how they might differently impact communities of different demographics as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And if it's all right, I might take the scenario question up front too. So just for a little bit of context, I think, probably 2015 or so, there was the development of this framework, or this group called the United Nations Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And it was a group of kind of federal financial regulators looking to develop a framework to quantify climate-related financial risk, because they recognize that there's likely to be broad financial impacts if we do not, as Secretary Blumenfeld was saying, embed the cost of climate into kind of financial institutions. And so as a result of that framework, we've really seen kind of, as I mentioned, overseas and now in the United States, this effort amongst the private sector, investors, and certainly regulators to try to understand what the financial impacts are of climate risk. And so I can at least speak from American family insurance perspective, and I guess the insurance industry broadly. This is definitely an up and coming new space that we are all trying to wrap our arms around. And from a scenario standpoint, we're certainly looking at scenarios, and primarily considering the UN's both regional concentration pathways, as well as the most recent UN report had the shared socioeconomic pathways. And there's also an organization called the Network for Greening the Financial System, which has developed similar climate scenarios. And all in all, I mean, to summarize, it's essentially a broad swath of different scenarios, from kind of best case, we turn off fossil fuel tomorrow and transition to renewable energy immediately, to kind of worst case, we embrace fossil fuels even more and we move forward with a fossil fuel future. And so each of these scenarios takes into account several climate drivers. And so what we're doing is trying to, define what those scenarios look like. And then for each of those scenarios, establish those drivers. And then for each of those drivers, attempt to determine, are there quantifiable signals that we can monitor in order to kind of assess the potential impacts over time, both for our business, but then also for the customers and the communities we serve. So with that bit of background, I think some of the drivers that we're definitely looking at, climate change policy is probably number one, right? So what is going on at a national level? What's going on at an international level? We have COP26 coming up. Are there any substantial outcomes from that? Does that move the needle at all? Things like the federal infrastructure bill and other national policy is important to monitor, as well as state policy. You know, we write business in many states across the country, so we need to be mindful of various state policy. I think climate forcing and climate projections get a bit out of my lane, but this is, you know, the climate science aspects of it. So it's my understanding, according to the most recent UN report, we're kind of locked into the current natural disasters that we're experiencing, if not seeing those getting worse over the next 10 years or so, even if we drastically change things today. So we need to recognize that adaptation is important and key. And that kind of greenhouse gas emissions, even if they continue to reduce or start to reduce, we're going to see those impacts. So those impacts we're looking at, you know, chronic climate risks, including air, surface and water temperatures, glacier and ice melt, precipitation, and drought. So those are things we can put numbers on, thanks to climate scientists, and kind of monitor over time. I think some of these others begin to get a little more tricky. Again, this is all very complex and many interacting systems together to understand what the future might look like. So things like socio-demographic and macroeconomic trends are important. You know, do we see large, you know, swaths of populations moving into, you know, high risk areas? Is there, are folks leaving those type of areas as well? What does population growth look like? The costs of home construction, for example, is another thing we'll want to consider. I guess another item is financial investments. Are we seeing kind of the, you know, investors, you know, pumping capital into renewable technology? Are we seeing, you know, other investments in nature-based solutions or resilient infrastructure? Similarly, are technological advances improving in renewable energy? I would say also in terms of kind of climate modeling, are we, you know, it's anticipated will increase our maturity in long-term climate modeling. And then finally, I'll just close on two final ones here. Is stakeholder demands is a big one as well. I think if anything, we've heard today that we're seeing the younger generation for sure demanding change, rapid change, if that. But in addition to that, from a private sector standpoint, we also have regulators are increasing their interest on this. Investors and kind of third-party supply chain stakeholders, right? If you want to do business with certain businesses, you know, your actions on climate are critically important. And finally, I'll just say, you know, what is our collective response? I think in the insurance industry, there's been some movement. One of the most notable that I can think of is we kind of convened all of the largest insurers in the country, thanks to the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, or IBHS. And kind of wrote a blueprint of sorts, the insurer's principles for climate change adaptation, which outlines steps that we feel can be taken to help, you know, progress on adaptation. So, and those are the drivers we're looking at when we think about climate change scenarios, and how, you know, depending on those drivers, what the future scenarios might look like.
Great, a lot to think about there. I love that you said number one for driver of climate risk is climate policy, right? Like, I often try to describe, like, why is there so much variation in these scenarios? It's human behavior. Like, what are we going to do? Yep. And policy is really driving that. So, Dan, can we turn to you to get your thoughts on main drivers of climate risk here in Wisconsin?
Sure. I'm going to echo, I think, a lot of what Chris said. In thinking about climate risk, you're thinking about this in a couple of different bins. One, the direct risk from physical climate change, and then the other one, the risk from policy, I think is an important one. We focus primarily on the former, the direct risk from climate change. And here in Wisconsin, you know, some of the risks that we face are associated with warming. You know, oftentimes the risks get manifest as more threshold type events. So for example, heat waves, we may warm by say 5 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century over over our current conditions. But what that means is a tripling in the frequency of heat waves, tripling of frequency of warm nights, or quadrupling of frequency of warm nights. And the impacts of that in terms of risk are to human health. That if you don't sleep well at night, then it exacerbates all kinds of other issues. I'm laughing as I was up last night, not sleeping well because I've got 3 kids, and so that's the other. Other risks that we face. So one thing that we've seen in this last decade, especially that we're realizing, is increases in extreme events. We've seen such an increase in extreme precipitation events over the last decade that I actually question whether that full extent of the increase that we've seen is due to climate change, because it's been such a big increase. We do expect to see an increase in extreme events. I'm hopeful that this last decade was just that upward trend and then a blip above that even. But what it has informed us is how we deal with these extreme events, and so communities are taking this very seriously. Monroe County, for example, has developed a climate impact assessment process where they're looking at the role of extreme events and how to better mitigate all sorts of areas of their of things that matter to them. For example, looking at future development for land surface change, runoff, on a field that's converted to crop. It's very different than runoff from a agricultural area that's devoted to forest agriculture, for example. And so a shift towards forest agriculture is something that is recommended to improve runoff and improve water quality, improve more consistent stream flow, and the tourism industry there. So these, the other thing I guess I would comment on is Chris's comment, or Christopher's comment on complexity and propagating impacts. One of the things that I think is that I guess I've come to realize about climate impacts is that we're going to be surprised. One thing we absolutely know is that we're going to be surprised. And how do you set up a system, or how do you set up policy in a situation that where that's constantly evolving, where there's no equilibrium, a system that's, when you make an adjustment in one area of the system, the rest of the system adjusts. This is a complex system. And there are models of sustainability in that, but it's not what we think of as sustainability. It's not an end result where everybody sort of lives happily. It's a system where we're constantly learning from each other. We're constantly developing communication. We see this in computer systems where we develop redundant networks. We see this in our brains where we develop networks that are redundant, that communicate in different ways. And we build resiliency that way. So I'm not sure. Now maybe I'm off topic here, but these kinds of what do we think of in terms of sustainability? How do we mitigate risk as a community? And I think that's a necessary step for us.
I think that's a really important point for us to think about, is that there will be surprises. So we need to build in space to be able to respond to those surprises, right? So maybe for some of you, or even me, thinking about last year with the global pandemic, right, we reduced our carbon emissions, but that was almost completely made up by all the CO2 from the forest fires in Australia, bushfires, and here in California, which is like, oh, okay. And then, and how these fires are now affecting air quality here in Wisconsin, or even on the East Coast. Maybe that it's a surprise for a lot of people. We haven't fully thought through that feedback as well. So there are going to be surprises in a way, like from a scientific perspective, it's somewhat fascinating to watch these things play out that we've modeled and looked at and tried to understand. It's like you can see the experiment playing out in real time, but it's not fun watching that experiment play out in real time. And so this is where, as Dan said, the scientists here at the table really need to be connecting with people who are thinking about, how do we respond to this? How do we try to anticipate some of these risks, which is great segue to you, Kathy. And I am curious to know whether, you are thinking about different climate scenarios too in these risks or not.
So very much so, and very much consistent with what Kristofer is using and what Dan added to, same kind of sources that we are also studying at this time. But when we think of, so we know that it's a systematic, the entire financial system is going to be impacted by climate change, and the sustainability accounting overview board, that's not quite the right alphabet soup, but the Sustainability Accounting Board has looked at, out of the 79 sectors in business, 72 of those 79 sectors are going to be impacted by climate change. Obviously, oil and gas, some of the ones at the top will be impacted much more. But just about everyone is going to be touched by climate change. I think about, tourism, for example. We were supposed to take our first family vacation at the end of August, and we were supposed to go to Lake Tahoe. And 2 nights before, we had to scurry and completely change our plans because of the fires. And Lake Tahoe had literally shut down. The schools had shut down. The air quality was like in the 700s of, that's really, really bad. It's usually like 50 to 100. And so every customer. So if I'm a bank or a credit union, I'm a financial institution, and I'm making loans to all of these sectors, right? So my radar is going up as I think about those impacts to climate change. So from a financial standpoint, we kind of think about the physical risks, and those are the ones we talk about a lot. Wisconsin in particular has been wetter and warmer over the last few years, but we've got floods and droughts and fires and hurricanes and lake and sea level erosion, heat waves, everything. I think, Dan, you just read off the list of them. And there's also indirect physical risks, which we're seeing and feeling right now with supply chain, right? Obviously, the pandemic had a big part in that, but also climate change has also contributed to that. So again, if I'm a lender right now thinking about making loans, these are all things that I really have to consider. Those are the physical risks. There's also the transition risks that are really important to acknowledge and eventually quantify. And those are a little bit more elusive, a little bit more intangible, but they're the risks from policy changes. So when policy changes do happen, whether it's at the national level or the state level, that is going to have an impact on businesses across the state and across the nation, as are regulations. And so we've seen a lot of those regulations and those policies happen on the international level. And obviously the Biden administration is looking very closely at them, as are each and every one of the states at this point in time. New York, the Department of Financial Institutions has already come out with guidance on climate change. They're really a leader in this area and have hired a PhD in climate science. I can't even get enough regular examiners to do examinations, and they're able to hire a PhD in climate change, which is amazing. And she's done great things and been very accessible to all of us. The state of Washington has just come out with some guidance on climate change from their Department of Financial Institutions. And as of January of next year, they'll be asking banks and credit unions to answer some questions. It's a first step, kind of big toe in the water, but providing some information on what they're doing towards climate change. So I also think about when at DFI, we regulate state chartered institutions. So not necessarily all the really big banks, which have their own departments that are looking at this, but often have a geographical concentration. And so it's going to be really important for financial institutions to look at their own geographical area and see what their climate risks are and really understand what those are. And financial institutions can play a big role too with their customers. So first of all, I think it's important that they affirm each institution affirm climate change, that it's real and it's happening. and to do education and awareness and make sure that climate change isn't relegated to like one little department, but we think about like enterprise risk management, and that it is a legitimate risk within a financial institution. So just like running an insurance company, Kristofer, they're running a financial institution. There's many risks. You've got political, you've got regulatory, you've got economic, you've got technology, you've got social, and then you've got all the financial risks like liquidity and default and credit risk. Climate risk needs to be right up there as a legitimate risk with everything else, and really talked about and understood, and part of the strategic plan that a financial institution puts together. So part of our job at DFI is really to build awareness and to help educate and to connect the dots between all of our state agencies to make sure that we're really, again, safety and soundness of our financial institutions is so important. So we've got to figure out how to model and taking some of these drivers will be inputs into the models that financial institutions happen. And Dan, to your point about surprises, that's one of the beauties of doing these models. So I think back to that example I used in my opening about asset liability management and managing interest rate risk, right? You do interest rate shocks based on different scenarios to understand what the financial impact could be. And the same thing holds true in climate change and climate risk, is understanding what those scenarios are and then doing what if scenarios over and over again to understand like the spectrum of outcomes that could happen. And then have, just like you have a risk management plan or you have a business continuity plan, you have a resiliency plan. How would you react to those different scenarios? And just getting the discussions going and having that happen is really important. So we're delighted to see our financial industry move forward on this topic. We have a way to go before we mature in this area. So it's very new. And I'll admit, I'm in the learning process along with everyone else here. I've been so grateful for today's events because I've learned so much and connected with so many people. It is about community. It is going to take everyone working together to solve this or to adapt to what our future holds.
Great. So my next question was actually going to be about financial risks, and I think you've really touched on a lot of this already. That's okay, which is great. But I'm actually going to press you a little bit farther because for context, a few years ago when the most recent national climate assessment came out, I went on NPR and did an interview, and one of the phrases that I used was how this really impacts the health and the wealth of the American people. Right? These are like shared values that we can all connect about. Like this is going to affect your pocketbook, right? And I think one thing that particular assessment did really well is they talked about the different regional impacts across the country. And when you go online, they had a really nice digital interface where you could kind of look up in your area, what are these impacts going to be? So I'm new to the state of Wisconsin. If I want to understand, like more specifically in this region, what the financial risk might be for Wisconsin, maybe could you help me out a little bit there, what I would tell people?
Sure. So manufacturing is a big part of our economy, and it's going to impact, depending on what is being manufactured and where people live in those manufacturing towns and villages and cities. There might be migrants due to climate change where people can no longer live in areas that are repeatedly flooded time after time. Tourism, I spoke of a little bit before, but tourism is a huge part of our economy here. And again, if we get, incredible heat waves, we get droughts, we get, tornadoes, more tornadoes or more severe weather events, people aren't going to be like rushing to the Dells or rushing to, Hayward if they know the weather isn't going to be great. And then agriculture, just if anyone was in here for the session before, thinking about the climate change impacts on our agricultural society. So it is going to be felt by every single person. And we can't overlook the economic impacts to underrepresented communities. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on that today, but the impact has been so great. And our cities in particular need to be, we need more parks, we need more trees, we need to rectify some of our historic decisions that have put fossil fuel plants next to underserved communities, and the economic injustices that have happened through environmental decisions. We need to rectify those, and clean energy will give us that kind of second chance to be able to rectify many of the environmental injustices that have preceded us.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm wondering if Kristofer or Dan want to chime in on this question, and also something that Kathy touched on, this idea of the inequities of this financial risk across the state and what you see there.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm going to maybe just switch the perspective a bit. And often when we think about risk in general, it's a bad thing. And so I think one of the things that the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has done really well is also communicate that you also should be thinking about potential opportunities. And so I think, in terms of agriculture, if, I understand things correctly, there is the potential we could have a longer growing season, which could be beneficial dependent on what you're trying to grow or what crop you're putting in the ground. So I think, as we think about from a physical standpoint, adapting, it's important we understand these scenarios and take advantage of those for, broader economic benefits. Kind of similarly, if from a transitional standpoint, if we flip the switch tomorrow and move to a renewable future, I think from a job standpoint, we want to make sure that we're ready, that our manufacturing is supporting green technologies, that we have the skilled workforce that can support those jobs. So, thinking about these scenarios, those are also kind of the opportunity perspectives to keep in mind, and not necessarily always focus on the negative impacts. And in regards to the disproportionate impacts of climate change on communities, I think, certainly that is something that needs to be, top of mind. And I mentioned the insurer's principles for climate change adaptation. That is most definitely one of the principles that we've included is that those who are disproportionately impacted don't have access to insurance or other financial safety nets. They're the first to receive funding or the ability to, make themselves whole and restore in an appropriate from a financial standpoint, but a timely manner as well. You think about Katrina, Harvey, even the most recent freeze in Texas, often it's the, low-income communities of color that are being, the power's coming on last. So I think that has to be front and center of any sort of community resiliency adaptation strategy to keep that top of mind.
Yeah, it's a great reminder about thinking about the opportunity side of things too, right? Obviously, yes, you might lose jobs in one area, but you can create them in another, and that's an important perspective to have.
Yeah, and
add anything?
I guess I would like to add on that. I appreciate this conversation for this very much. One, the impacts to the disproportionate impacts to communities of color, to tribes, to other communities. We saw this in examples like the 1995 Chicago heat wave. If you look at which was I guess it's almost 20 years ago now, but if you look at heat vulnerability in Milwaukee right now, it lines up with historically redlined communities, and so the impacts of systemic racism and in our institutions is still felt today through the historical propagation of that, and that's something we need to be addressing. I want to talk about the transition risk as well. There are a lot of opportunities, and we're seeing people already taking advantage of this. MGE is one example that I like to bring up. MGE decided to move to 100% or to zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we at the Nelson Institute worked with them to look at their future scenarios to make sure that their thought process on that was reasonable. And Jeff Keeler, the CEO of MGE, announced this at their stakeholder meeting, where they have something like 1,000 people. They have lunch for something like 1,000 people in this giant room. And he announces, unbeknownst to them, that MGE is decided to go zero carbon emissions by 2050. The first question he gets from their stakeholders is, what does this mean for our portfolios? And his response was, this is good. Every dollar we spend on fossil fuels in the state is a dollar we send out of the state. It's a dollar that we don't control the energy production. It's a fluctuation that is unstable for our consumers and for our stakeholders. By transitioning to renewables, which is, and boy, let's talk about American families work on that as well. By transitioning to renewables, we provide more stable electricity or more stable energy for our consumers and a more stable financial investment. So these opportunities exist already, and we need to be looking for these win-win opportunities. Dane County is another example. The collecting methane from the landfill and selling that. They built a $28 million plant to collect methane from the landfill, converted into renewable natural gas. That'll pay for itself in 3 years. The money they make from that then goes to Dane County and reduces taxpayer burden. So there are a lot of opportunities here that we need to be looking for.
Yeah, that's great. So I think building on that, Dan, especially with your work with the Nelson Institute, what do you think are some of the best practices that you're seeing out there from local and state governments in kind of managing this financial risk aspect?
I think there, and this is a little out of my area. Actually, I'd be curious to hear what what our other panelists here have to say as well. What I've seen is looking for win-win opportunities. There's different sort of like bins you can put these in. One is just assessing risk, current existing risk, and changing policy to deal with that. So, for example, human health and the Department of Health Services doing work in that area. The other one is future investments. As you're investing in infrastructure, what does climate change mean for the way you design buildings, the way you design sewage systems, the way you manage dams, et cetera? And then win-win situations. What are opportunities things you might not have thought of? But once you sit down and have the conversation and you start going through the scenario development, inevitably, because we're in this complex system, inevitably there's exciting opportunities that no one's really thought of yet. And so, thinking about these in ways to manage risk in some of those ways.
Yeah. And what about you, Kristofer? From your perspective, what are some of the best practices you think you're seeing?
Yeah. So first, just a quick stat that I brought with me too, just to highlight the potential opportunities for adaptation specifically. The National Institute of Building Sciences did a study, and they determined that up to $13 can be made or saved for every dollar invested in mitigation and adaptation. So when you think about community infrastructure, enhancing it post disaster event, you're really investing for the long term, especially as these disasters get worse and worse. So just a point on that from an investment standpoint. And I think to add to Dan's comment about, at least from a community perspective, the only thing I would add is seek out public-private partnerships. I think being in the private sector in the insurance industry, but it's not just insurance alone. I think the private sector is looking for opportunities to engage the public sector on this type of work and looking to collaborate, to invest, to develop new innovative funding mechanisms to help support communities. So I think that would be the only thing I would add. And we're seeing some of that play out. One of the really interesting financial mechanisms that I'll just say here that is out in California is this concept of a forest resiliency bond. And in essence, what this nonprofit has done is partnered with kind of the U.S. Forest Service as well as their local water utility to get financial backing to support this bond that then private sector kind of stakeholders invest into. So now the proceeds of that bond then go to forest management in places like the Yuba National Forest to help thin the forest and reduce wildfire impacts. The thought process is by doing that, you're saving taxpayers' dollars, and that's why the utility is backing it with their financial resources. So things like that are popping up slowly, but definitely are also complex and require kind of leadership. So I think, those are some of the things we're seeing from a kind of innovative trend perspective.
Great. And then Kathy, I would like your perspective too. And maybe you could tell us a bit about Stronger Wisconsin too while you're at it.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So Governor Evers always says no big issue in this state can be solved by one agency alone. And he always talks about us connecting the dots. And as a matter of fact, that was a question in all of our job interviews. So we have a cabinet that works really, really closely together, and we talk about climate change. I and my colleagues have all done presentations at cabinet meetings. We've had discussions on it. So we've created an initiative called Stronger Wisconsin. And just to start out, we're going to crawl before we walk, before we run. 3 secretaries. So myself, Commissioner Afable from the Office of the Commissioner of Insurance, and Dawn Krim, who is the newly confirmed Secretary of the Department of Safety and Professional Services, have all gotten together and created this initiative called Stronger Wisconsin. And what we're doing is really looking at from end to end the building process here in Wisconsin to make sure that there's incentives to be able to build both sustainably and with resilience in mind. And it's just been a great effort. It's new. So if you haven't heard about it, keep your ears open. And if you're interested, shoot me an email afterwards and we'll add you to our communication list. And actually, Kristofer has been a big part of this. And thank you to him and to American Family for helping us through this. So we took a tour of 6 structures in Door County. And each one was built sustainably. We went with the architect, or we talked to the builders, we talked to the tradespeople, we talked to appraisers, we talked to the owners and the challenges they had trying to get financing for their house. And we heard all of the obstacles from the building codes to the appraisal process, to the insurance process, all the way through to actually finally maybe getting a loan. And so our commitment is really to break down those barriers and really get some action, get some things done here that will incentivize people to build both sustainably and with resilience. And it really is a public-private kind of communal partnership. So again, we'll welcome anyone into our tent. We're actually going to Milwaukee on Friday to look at some of the flood plain issues, working with the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District. And so we want to educate and build awareness and invite the public to participate in with us so that we can identify solutions and help move this process forward. So we are super excited about this initiative.
That sounds great. Right. So at this point, I'd like to move to taking questions from the audience, and for anyone who's joining us online too, can ask some questions. If we have any questions, raise your hand and someone will come to you with a microphone.
Hi, thank you all for a great talk. Early on, it was mentioned about the NOAA $1 billion events. And notably in those calculations, health costs are not accounted for, either from direct loss of life or healthcare expenditures. And I was interested to hear what you all had to say about how health risks from climate risks factor into your thinking.
That's a fantastic question. I often ask this question of I feel like in a lot of these financial considerations that there's maybe no like dollar value put on the very real currency of human life, which is, I think, what your question is getting at. So I'm curious to know from whoever wants to tackle that one on the panel.
Good. I feel like that's a great question for Dr. Jonathan Patz.
Yeah.
But I'll just know. I mean, my initial thought is then that would mean that the overall economic impacts, health impacts, the dollars are going to be greater, right? So just further inflating those costs. So I think from our perspective too, it just further emphasizes the challenges in attempting to quantify climate related risk, right? I guess that's the thought I have is as we think about future scenarios and the impacts, we have to at some point put boundaries on the system we're looking at. And certainly I think as an insurer who offers health insurance, I think, we are interested in the health impacts of climate. But yeah, it just, I think, emphasizes the point of how complex this is and the cascading impacts of climate risk. And we mentioned disproportionate impacts earlier. I think Harvard, I'm not exactly sure, but I remember hearing Harvard came out with a study kind of spring of 2020 that said areas with greater air pollution, individuals who contracted COVID had, some percentage greater risk of complications. And typically areas with greater air pollution are those that are low income or communities of color. So certainly an important thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about it.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great topic to bring up, a very important part of it. Right now, it feels more intangible, but I think just like we saw in interest rate risk management, as things mature and evolve, we'll be able to likely be able to put some kind of factor in our models to help quantify that, at least to have representation of it in the model. But I don't think we're there yet. But thank you for bringing it up. It's a really important component of measuring risk.
Yeah, that's it. I know that, so bringing up Jonathan Patz as well, there was a recent study by Patz and I'm going to blank on the study and the results of the study, but it did take a look at what the health impacts of zero emissions in Wisconsin were. And they were enormous. The benefits are enormous. And so again, looking at opportunities here. And beyond that, there's a really good question because we're focused on financial institutions, I think, with this panel here, but thinking about how you measure success, there's a dollar sign associated with some of that, but oftentimes there's not. What's the financial cost of losing a culture? What's the financial cost of losing a land ethic or a something you grew up with? And that's another area that we, personally we think about that gets back to health through mental health and through the effects of climate change on mental health that people are looking at as well. But so it's a great question and it opens up a lot of from a researcher, fun opportunities to think, but kind of depressing opportunities as well.
Can I just add two resources too you might find interesting? North Carolina developed a really interesting statewide climate risk and resiliency plan and assessment, which I believe looked at health impacts across the state. So that might just be an interesting resource to look at. And then also FEMA has a national, what do they call it, risk factor index, which takes into account social vulnerability. How exactly that's all calculated on the back end, I'm unsure, but it may be interesting to dive into.
And DHS also has a series of social risk factors for climate change. If you look at their website, building resilience against climate change, against climate extremes, they have a set of that for Wisconsin as well. So worth looking into.
Other questions? I think there were a few more hands up.
Hi, I want to say thank you to American Family. My payments are going to good use. My question is, Kathy, you mentioned a sustainability and renewables email list or web. Could you say that again, please?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, the email list for Stronger Wisconsin.
Oh, yes. You can just send me an email at kathy.blumenfeld@dfi.wisconsin.org or .gov, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
So, and we'll get you added.
Direct email.
That's service for you right there. Just email the
I'm
director
here
of the
to serve
Department
you.
of Financial Institutions.
Thank you. Are you aware of concerted effort by the insurance and banking industries to support any sort of carbon trading, carbon tax quantification system as part of risk and resilience efforts? Is there any industry support for those systems, or that's just politically not going to happen?
I can speak in the banking world, I think there's, as I mentioned, this awakening happening. So we just got every quarter, the Conference of State Bank Supervisors does a survey of bankers to understand like their sentiment at the time. And for the first time this last quarter, climate risk just got on the radar. So I think from the and larger banks, maybe they might have more, they're a little bit farther ahead, but from state supervised banks and credit unions, I think they're not there yet at this point. I don't know if you want to talk about the insurance.
Yeah, so I'll bring it up again, but the insurance principles for climate change adaptation, we had extensive conversations with many of the top insurance companies across the country in developing those recommendations. And I will say, just as an industry, we've focused primarily on adaptation. I think, for, thinking about climate related disasters, how we can adapt to those and protect our customers. So carbon tax, carbon trading has not been a topic that I'm aware of that's kind of top of the list. We've really much more taken that adaptation perspective on the overall climate kind of conversation. So.
Hi, thank you all. This has been super interesting. My question is for Kristofer. So there's this kind of idea of like double materiality in the sustainable finance sphere. So looking at not only what's the impact of climate change on financial institutions, but also the impact of financial institutions' actions and investments on the climate. I guess, what's the process you guys go through, or how much are you looking at that for your own operations? And do you see any sort of future regulatory action in this area? I know that's kind of difficult to predict, but.
Yeah, great question. So kind of two questions there just to make sure I understand kind of materiality process, but then also anticipating regulatory action. Okay. So I guess the first one, or I'll take the second one, regulatory action. I think as we monitor both federal and state regulatory, I don't want to say action, but kind of increasing importance and emphasis on climate related risk. I mean, Secretary Blumenfeld threw out all the alphabet soup, but I mean, quite literally, it's the SEC, the Federal Reserve, the Commodity Trading Futures Commission. Just recently, the U.S. Treasury and the Financial Insurance Office released some notice on climate related risk and seeking comment. So, I mean, every federal agency and the FIO is kind of the head federal regulatory body, and then filters down to the states, is talking about climate related risk. And there's a handful of states that are really, prioritizing this: Washington, California, New York. So I think in terms of anticipation, I think we're anticipating some sort of regulatory action on climate risk for sure. There's already at a state level requests to submit comments on how you're approaching climate related risk assessments and adaptation, and also what you're doing from reducing your own emissions. So kind of we're currently responding to regulators, and I only expect that to increase. From a materiality standpoint, we are definitely utilizing kind of the materiality approach and just for the group materiality assessments, or determining what's material to your organization, kind of looks at both internal business operations, but also external stakeholder groups. So what you can influence as a business, but what's important to your stakeholder groups. So we are actively working through a process to do that and attempting to get at kind of a top list, right? Because you can't, address it all. Need to kind of narrow in on some priority topics. So.
Hi, my name is Juliette Plusky. Thank you so much. I think all of your words have been really valuable and very insightful too. So I am wondering if any of you could comment on your thoughts about the flood insurance being regulated through the federal government as opposed to more local or private. It was just a podcast through Planet Money talking about this and how I think something like 25% of all money going into rebuilding homes is to 1% of homes that are being damaged due to floods. And so this is kind of just continuing to allow for these homes to be built in the same locations as opposed to moving and stuff. And you saw that with Hurricane Katrina as well. And so I'm just curious, how can we combat that, if at all? And if you at all are thinking about that. Thanks.
Sounds like a question for
Me?
Kristofer.
Yeah. So couple of highlights, I think, for that question, and excellent question. So from an American Family standpoint, we do not offer currently a flood insurance product, but I think your point's well taken. A broad challenge when you think about the National Flood Insurance Program. It's my understanding that it's not profitable and kind of at a basic level, right? They're not making any money to sustain that program. That said, and this is, again, things are moving so fast in this space, admittedly, I need to educate myself. There was just some recent federal action on updating the flood insurance program that I haven't dived into yet. But I think one of the primary challenges is the out-of-date maps that are utilized with the flood insurance program, and they don't reflect for the increasing precipitation that we're seeing. So I think often what happens is people move into areas that aren't mapped in a floodplain. So they're not forced into getting flood insurance. However, if you think about, how floods are looking like today, we're seeing the 200, I don't know if this is accurate, but the 200-year storm, 500-year storm, several times a year. So those individuals then are impacted because of the flood maps, right? So, so I don't know that I have a direct answer, but I know certainly a challenge. And like we talked about, maybe a theme for this conversation is also an opportunity, right? So when you think about new innovative insurance products like parametric insurance and new ways to fill what's called the protection gap, those that aren't insured, flood is definitely a space that I think could, yield competitive advantages for some. So.
Do you think about it though in the context of, are you going to insure a house? Like, are you just relying on the flood maps that are there, or thinking about doing something better in that space?
So again, speaking from my industry knowledge, not at what we're doing at American Family, I would say that it's complex, and the underwriting process would take into account many different factors, including the flood maps. One non-insurance comment, I believe it's not Zillow, but was it realtor.com, provides a flood rating. So, I think that's the other thing, is educating homeowners in advance. So that's a pretty new innovative approach from an online realtor company to say, hey, this is actually what your flood risk score is related to this property.
It is. And then there was some research that looked at how that impacted potential buyers, and it actually further entrenched them away in their, initial views, rather than trying to get them. It was really fascinating research. It didn't have the impact you thought it might have.
Didn't deter buyers?
No, it meant people ignored that even more. So it was just, if they wanted to buy the house, they wanted to buy the house. It was really, it had the opposite effect of what it was intended. This is something I thought a lot when I studied sea level rise and in Florida, that he answered the basic part of your question, is that it's not profitable. That's why it's at the national level, right? And so it's a problem, because a lot of these flood maps are out of date. One of the problems with updating them is it changes the real estate market overnight, right? And it's an enormous impact. And a lot of new maps have been made, and they just haven't been released yet, because there's all this discussion about what the impacts of just releasing those maps
Transition risk.
to be. And now I'm the,
that's transition risk, right?
There.
In action. Also, fires, I think, are going to become another area where, it's not, the profitability is certainly not going to be there. And how do, we stop rebuilding in the same place over and over again that keeps having these fires? So that's just another topic on the horizon. But to Kristofer's point, and staying positive, that does provide opportunity as well, and innovation and entrepreneurship.
So I feel like we're like really just getting going on this discussion, but I unfortunately, as the moderator, have to bring this to a close. But I think in so doing, I really encourage everyone to continue this conversation outside of this space, right? One of my role models, Catherine Hayhoe, is always talking about the most important thing that everyone can do is to talk about this issue, but especially with people who are not in this room, right? Who are not in your social media bubble, or whether it's you're riding in a taxi cab, maybe you don't do that anymore because of the pandemic, whatever it is, when you're out there in the world, meeting other people, I really encourage you to have these conversations. And I think when you do, you'll both learn something. It's not like one person telling the other. We'll all learn from that process and hopefully make progress together. So thanks for being here today.